So there you have it, the closings by both the prosecution and defense in this case. Now, the prosecution is saying there was definite premeditation, and the defense is saying no. This is a man who has autism. He wasn't able to make those decisions, and they're putting the blame completely on Gypsy Blanchard. Now, I want to go to my very special guest, Matthew Mangino, a criminal defense attorney, and I want to get your perspective, Matthew, about what you thought about the closings. Was there one that you thought was stronger, and ultimately, do you think that Mr. Godejohn is going to be found guilty of first-degree murder?
Well, I thought the prosecution did what they needed to do, and that was to focus in on what this case is really about. I mean, we've heard a lot of other things about Dee Dee and the way she treated her daughter Gypsy and Gypsy's manipulation in this case, but really they drilled down to the very core of this, and that is, was there deliberation? First-degree murder requires an intentional killing with deliberation. And I think that they methodically showed that there was, in fact, deliberation here. There was thought. I mean, there was, that just in the closing of the rebuttal, he said, I waited a minute to see if I wanted to really do this, and then I did it. I mean, there's clearly planning, which is premeditation. There's clearly deliberation here. And I think the defense had to come up with something, and what they came up with really doesn't relate to what this case is about.
Now, the victim in this case, Dee Dee Blanchard, she's certainly not the most sympathetic victim that we've seen here on Law and Crime. Now, do you think that that is somehow going to play into the jurors' minds, and maybe one or two jurors just feel bad for Mr. Godejohn and then are unable to convict him?
Well, I think that certainly Dee Dee is not a sympathetic figure. Although Gypsy may have been a sympathetic figure for what she had gone through throughout her life under the spell of her mother, but this is not Gypsy who killed her mother, although she was involved in the process. What we're dealing with here is the defendant who actually killed her. You can't sort of kill by proxy, and to use kind of a play on words of one of the issues that was brought up in this case. Yeah, maybe there will be some sympathy, but the bottom line is that the defendant in this case admitted that he killed Dee Dee Blanchard, and he was very clear that he planned it, participated in the planning of it, and in fact deliberated about it before he carried it out.
Yes, Matthew, I actually completely agree with you, and I'm looking forward to talking more about this after a quick break. So, Matt, I thought that this was very powerful, that the prosecution here was acknowledging Gypsy's role, but saying it didn't play a part in the actual legal determination of whether Mr. Godejohn was guilty. Do you think that was a smart move on behalf of the prosecution?
Oh, yes, it was a very smart move because they can't ignore something that's been a huge part of this trial. And so, if there's anything that would provide some sympathy for Nicholas, it was this testimony about the way Dee Dee treated Gypsy. To ignore that in a closing argument would leave a big void for the jury. So I think they're doing the appropriate thing. Any evidence that could potentially be damaging to them, they're taking it on. They're explaining why, yes, this is part of the evidence in this case. You have to listen to it, but it's not a justification for Nicholas's conduct. And I think they made that point pretty clear.
Yeah, I agree. I think Gypsy is very sympathetic, so they definitely had to address it. Let's get back to the closings and listen for a little bit more. So we're continuing to hear more about the prosecution's closing. Now, Matt, I have a question for you. Ultimately, do you think that Gypsy's testimony helped or hurt the defense? I say that because while she did take a fair amount of blame herself, she said it was her idea, a lot of bad facts came out for Mr. Godejohn, and a lot of the steps that he took in helping to plan this murder and key decisions he made came back.
Well, you're right. I mean, there had to be the defense had to make a decision. You have to take the good with the bad in terms of this particular witness, Gypsy Blanchard. She specifically said, "I planned this. It was my idea." But there was also testimony in there, with regard to things like Nicholas wanting to sexually assault Dee Dee, and the aspect that he wanted Gypsy to clean up, while she was in the nude because that turned him on, and there was also the discussion. And she laid it out pretty specifically that they had planned this. Would they use arson? Would they use a gun? Would they use some other means to carry this out? So this wasn't something that came up on a whim. Let's do this. I hate my mother, and Nicholas agrees, and they go and do it. This was a methodically planned execution of Dee Dee Blanchard, and I think Gypsy's testimony, while it was sympathetic, she tried to take responsibility. She also laid out some pretty damning evidence when it came to Nicholas.
Yes. And so in this case, Mr. Godejohn made the decision not to testify. He said he would testify in the penalty stage. We did hear a little bit from him through these other interviews that he gave. What do you think about that decision that he made with his defense attorneys to not testify? Was that a smart decision?
Well, that's always, the most difficult decision when defending a client in a criminal case. Will that client take the witness stand? And what can that client offer in terms of his defense that can't be offered through other means? Certainly the only thing we did hear from him was not good. He's being interviewed. He admits to the crime, and he graphically describes it. But the other issue is, if you put him on the witness stand, what other doors does that open up in terms of cross-examination by the prosecution, and what kind of witness will he make? We know that part of the argument here is that he has diminished capacity because he's on the autism spectrum, and that he has Asperger's. So how would he react? I mean, one of the symptoms, so to speak, of being on the autism spectrum is the inability to communicate. And so how would that portray him as a witness in his own defense in this case?
Exactly. There are many perils to having a defendant take the witness stand. We're going to take a very quick break, but after that, we're going to continue with more closings in the Nicholas Godejohn trial. So what you're hearing right now is more of that closing argument by the prosecution in this case. Now, Matt, I want to ask you a legal question here. The judge in this case, when he said that he was talking to the jurors, he was telling them, if they find Mr. Godejohn guilty of first-degree murder, he will be sentenced to life without parole. And I have to say, in my practice as a criminal defense attorney, I've never heard the jury being told what the penalty is. So can you talk a little bit about that, and if that's normal, and if it's going to sway the jurors?
Well, I think it's highly unusual, certainly side in different options that are available. And I think what that does in this case is that it tells the jury, hey, this guy, if we convict him of he's going to jail for life without the possibility of parole. And that's a harsh sentence. And I think that may weigh on the jurors to some extent when they take a look at this whole picture. We've already talked about the fact that there's, manipulation, that there's the issue of child abuse with regard to Gypsy, and, it was Nicholas in any way justified in what he did because of that history. And if there is sympathy for Nicholas Godejohn because of that, and the idea that, hey, he did a bad thing here, he did a terrible thing here, but do we want to send him to prison for life when Gypsy, who said she planned this, only got a 10-year sentence? So that's significant. That telling the jury about that penalty for first-degree murder is significant in this case.
It could certainly be a way that they get a not guilty on the first-degree murder because they just don't want to send away someone for life without parole. We have to take a quick break right now, but we'll be back shortly with more of the prosecutor's closing arguments. Stay tuned. Again, more of the closing arguments by the prosecution. Now, Matt, the prosecution is making, at least to me, a very convincing argument. Was the defense able to salvage itself at least with their expert witness? It was Dr. Franks, and Dr. Franks said that Mr. Godejohn had autism, impaired perception, paranoia, and depression. Do you think in any way that's going to sway the jury into thinking that maybe he couldn't actually premeditate and plan this murder?
Well, you know, that argument about diminished capacity, or that testimony, certainly, you know, the jurors are they're gonna weigh that. I mean, the autism spectrum and the other issues that have been presented in terms of depression, you know, that in some way diminish his capacity. But what the prosecution is doing here in this argument, which I think is very compelling, is trying to refocus the jurors. Hey, you're going to hear a lot of stuff. You already did hear a lot of stuff about autism spectrum and Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and a lot of that stuff, you know, might be swirling around in the jurors' heads. But the prosecution is saying, hey, focus. You know, the issue here is very specific. You know, was there cool reflection? Was there deliberation? And let me show you, ladies and gentlemen, how we've proven deliberation in this case. You know, the planning, all the items that he laid out very methodically there, I think is a very effective
I completely agree with what you're saying there, Matt. I think the prosecution did a very strong job here, but we unfortunately have to take a very quick break, but we're going to get right back to the commentary on the Nicholas Godejohn case. Stay tuned. Thank you for that reporting, Aaron. So I want to dive a little bit more into those text messages, Matt. I want to know, is there any way those text messages can be interpreted as anything but premeditation? Specifically, I'm thinking about those messages about when Mr. Godejohn is asking Gypsy about whether her mother is a light sleeper or whether the floors squeak. Is there any other way we can interpret those text messages?
Well, they're certainly indicative of planning, of reflection, of deliberation. I mean, you know, and if you look at it, you know, from a cold, calculating standpoint, you know, he doesn't want to leave a stone unturned. He wants to make sure every aspect of this case, every aspect of this crime is going to be thought about, is going to be discussed, is going to be thoroughly planned. You know, it certainly makes it clear that there was, you know, cold, calculated deliberation in this case.
Yes, yeah, I agree. I really don't see how we can look at those text messages in any other way. Now, the defense was unsuccessful in keeping out Mr. Godejohn's confession. Do you think this case would have been changed at all if that confession was actually not able to make it into evidence?
Well, the confession, you know, hearing Nicholas, in his own words, admit to this crime is really the best possible evidence that you can have in this particular case. Certainly, you could have built a case based on these text messages, based on the testimony of Gypsy. She would be, you know, the cornerstone of this case. She would have to come forward and say, hey, I planned this, but we worked on it together, and he carried it out. But you know, for the jurors to hear in his own words, look at the defendant talking and admitting this crime, is really as good as you can get.
The confession is definitely hurting him. I agree with you on that. So let's now look at the defense closing. We've heard from the prosecution. Let's see what the defense's argument is. Let's take a look. Thank you, Anthony, for those top crime stories. They're all extremely heartbreaking, especially the one about Nicholas Cruz and the school shooting. But I do want to move on to the Chris Watts case. Now, if you recall, the Chris Watts case is out of North Carolina. Now, he has pled guilty to killing his pregnant wife and his 2 young children. Now, this story made national headlines because at first he denied that he had done anything. He said that there was a killer out there. It certainly wasn't him. But then in a sudden twist, he decided to plead guilty on this case. Yet, you would think that would be done and over, the end of the story. He's pled guilty. What more is there to discuss? However, on the eve of sentencing, it's on Monday, his parents, Mr. Watts' parents, have now come forward and are saying that the plea may not be entirely voluntary, and they want to speak at the sentencing hearing. So they have filed a motion to be able to do so. So what they're saying here, you can see from your screen that specifically Chris has been coerced into making this confession. He's had no other options than to take this plea. He has been denied his constitutional rights, and they want to have a new attorney speak to Chris. So this leaves a lot of questions in the air. Can he take back his guilty plea? So I want to discuss this a little bit more with our legal expert, a criminal defense attorney. Matt, what are your thoughts on this? First, I want to talk about what you think, if you think that Mr. Watts' parents are going to be able to speak at this sentencing hearing on Monday.
Well, it appears that they will be able to speak. They will be able to testify because the court has acknowledged that as grandparents of the 2 deceased children, that they are under the law crime victims. And so they would have an opportunity to testify at the sentencing like any other victim would, and to provide a victim's impact statement. But here it's an interesting twist because although they're going sort of under the auspices of being victims because they're the grandparents of the children, they really want to testify on behalf of the defendant. Their claim is interesting, that he was coerced into pleading guilty to life in prison, essentially, 3 consecutive counts of life in prison to save himself from the death penalty. But the law is clear, particularly in my jurisdiction in Pennsylvania. I actually argued a similar case in front of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that said that the threat, the pressure of facing the death penalty is not coercive to the point where it would nullify the voluntariness of a plea to life in prison. And so this issue has come up before, and I don't think that it's going to have much of an impact on this sentencing as well.
Well, what if there's a credible argument that his counsel has been ineffective in some other way? Is he going to have the opportunity to now take back his guilty plea?
Well, I don't know if that's going to be enough for him to take back his guilty plea at this sentencing hearing, but that might be an issue that could be raised on appeal because one of the bases for appealing a guilty plea in sentencing is that your counsel was ineffective. And in fact, the United States Supreme Court has made it clear that if counsel is ineffective in the plea bargaining process, that's a reason to overturn a decision. And that's relatively recent case law by the United States Supreme Court.
And so what makes this story very interesting is that when Watts was carrying out this murder, he actually had a mistress. He had a woman that he was seeing behind his wife's back. Now, she has come out publicly and said when she found out that his wife and children were missing and that he was telling certain lies, she went straight to the sheriff's office, and she has made public statements that she believes Chris Watts is absolutely guilty. Now, we don't know if she's actually going to testify at the sentencing hearing on Monday, but can you talk a little bit about the impact her coming to the sentencing hearing and asking for the maximum punishment, if that's going to have an impact, and what that might be?
Well, if she has the ability to come before the court, as a victim in this case, possibly to have a victim's impact statement to show how this has impacted her. I mean, I think the most significant thing here is that Kris Watts pled guilty to evade the death penalty, and he agreed to accept multiple life in prison sentences. And now, is he going to be able to withdraw that plea because somehow, in some way, he was coerced? I mean, the court could say, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll let you withdraw your plea and you go to trial and you can face the death penalty. And if you get convicted and sentenced to death, that's your prerogative. But I don't know that the court will make it that easy.
Do you think that Watts made the correct decision here? Because when he took this plea, he is now, he's not at risk of the death penalty anymore. If he had gone to trial and lost, he certainly would have been at risk of the death penalty. Now he's just going to have life in prison. So really the question is, was that a good choice, or should he have gambled and gone to trial?
Well, it's the specter of life in prison without the possibility of parole is not great. I mean, I think when you reflect on that for a minute and say, wait a second, I just agreed to spend the rest of my life behind bars without any possibility of parole. The question is, it's a balancing for Kris Watts. Do I want to roll the dice and see if I can avoid the death penalty? But I think the other issue here is, if you were convicted and you were sentenced to death, when are you going to be executed? What's the likelihood of you being executed? I mean, executions are way down in this country. There's only been 21 the entire year, and you have over 3,000 people on death row. I mean, is a death sentence sort of a quasi life in prison sentence?
I think that's an excellent point, because we see so many people on death row actually die of natural causes before the lethal injection, because the appeals process, it just takes so long to actually reach that stage. So thank you so much, Matt, for that very insightful commentary on the Kris Watts sentencing. And make sure to follow Law and Crime. We'll be covering this thoroughly on Monday, so stay tuned. But for now, we have to take a quick break. We'll be back shortly. So what you're hearing more of is the defense closing in this case. Now, I want to break down this closing a little bit more, Matt. I keep hearing different phrases being used by the defense attorneys. One of the things that I heard that really caught my eye, or rather my ear, is when he says everyone is a victim here. Now, what do you think about that? Because I struck that as going two ways. That could be something that is seen as highly inappropriate because there's a dead woman, or it can really ask the jurors to be empathetic for three people who clearly have suffered a lot in this trial. Would love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the defense is trying to suggest to the jury that, in fact, Nicholas Godejohn is a victim as well. We know that Dee Dee Blanchard's a victim. She's dead. We know that Gypsy Blanchard is a victim. She was subject to this abuse over an extended period of time. And now the defense is trying to say that Nicholas Godejohn is also a victim because he was manipulated by Gypsy, because he has a diminished capacity, and he was coerced or pushed or deceived into committing this crime.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. It's just this trial has had a lot of different interesting aspects. I think one of them is, even though we don't hear from Mr. Godejohn himself, we're seeing interview clips. And now I want to ask you, Matt, as a criminal defense attorney who's no doubt represented many, many people, would you ever have one of your clients speak with a journalist?
No, I think that is an awful idea. It's the same as speaking with the police. If you're suspected of a crime, I don't think any defense attorney worth his or her salt is going to say, yeah, go ahead, be interviewed by the police. And so just because it's a journalist, that journalist is going to ask probing questions, and those questions are going to make their way to the authorities. It's a really a poor decision to permit your client to do that, but that doesn't mean that your client doesn't do it on his or her own. and you don't know anything about it, and you learn about it later. That's a terrible position to be in as a defense attorney.
And that's a good point, because his attorneys could have said, please don't speak to anybody, but then he decides to do it out of his own accord. And we see those interviews just being very bad, because he said, quote, "I know full well what I was capable of" in one of the interviews. And that was definitely something that later came back to haunt him. Now, another thing that I want to talk about is those Facebook messages. And those were the messages that first alerted authorities that something might be wrong in the Blanchard household. So I want to talk a little bit more about what significance you thought they had in this trial, because they were actually written by Gypsy herself.
Right, Yosha, those messages are the puzzling part of this. Obviously, you've planned out this homicide. You've been sort of meticulous in the way that you planned it, every detail, and then you leave town and you want your mother's body to be found. So you send these messages that say, the bitch is dead, and other things, which are certainly easily tracked back to Wisconsin, where they were sent from, and lead the authorities to the defendants in this case. It was a surprising twist in this planned execution.
Yes, and this case has been full of surprising twists. It's just been a case that I have never seen, and I don't think many of our viewers have ever seen anything like this. Now, let's continue to watch the defense closing. Let's take a look. So that's more of the prosecution's rebuttal statement. Again, they get the last word. I feel as if they have been pretty clear-cut, pretty precision-focused here, laying out all the elements of first-degree murder, Matt. But my question is, if we look at the whole case now that it's all run through, is there anything that you think that the prosecution should have emphasized more in their closing argument? Or did they do everything perfectly?
Well, I thought they did a nice job of trying to stay focused on the issue of first-degree murder in an intentional act with deliberation. The challenge for the defense here was to present diminished capacity. And they tried to do a little bit of that in the closing, where they talked about, what kind of criminal would take a taxi to the crime scene and back, who would go and live with one of the defendant's parents after the crime, who would mail the murder weapon in the mail to another address. But I think, what the prosecution needed to do, and probably were effective at, was that, hey, these are not the smartest criminals in the world, but they're criminals nonetheless, and they're responsible for their conduct. So, just because you don't do the crime in the best possible manner that it could be carried out doesn't mean that you have diminished capacity. And that's the challenge for the defense. I think what they have to hope is that, the jurors, they've heard so much about these mental health issues and this sympathetic testimony of Gypsy. And maybe, in a way, it's almost like juror nullification. Let's set aside the fact that he deliberated, that it was an intentional act. He doesn't deserve life in prison, and so we're going to find him guilty of something less than first-degree murder.
All right. Yes, I completely agree with you. I think the defense was not completely effective by saying that they were doing childlike actions. Again, you can be a stupid killer and still be convicted of murder. And so we're going to head back and hear more of the prosecution's rebuttal. Take a listen. And there you have it, the prosecutor's rebuttal argument. Now, Matt, I just want to thank you so much for being with us here today. You have provided some excellent legal analysis. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Yosha. And you did a great job, and I hope we get to do it again.
Thank you so much. And thank you, viewers, for following along with the Nicholas Godejohn trial. Stay tuned, because we might get a verdict on Monday. And also stay tuned for the Daily Debrief with Aaron Keller coming up in just a few moments. Thank you. Good night.